The Watcher House, a true crime documentary script. In the spring of 2014, a family in New Jersey did everything right. They found a beautiful old house in a safe, quiet town. They saved for years to afford it. They passed every inspection. They signed the papers, packed their lives into boxes, and prepared to start over in a place built for exactly the kind of life they wanted for their children. They never spent a single night there. Not because the house was haunted, not because it was unsafe in any way an inspector could measure. They left because of letters. 4 of them typed and mailed over the course of about a year and a half from someone who called themselves the Watcher. To this day, nobody knows who wrote them. This is the story of 657 Boulevard, Westfield, New Jersey, one of the strangest unsolved cases in modern American history. No one was physically harmed. No crime in the traditional sense was ever proven to have occurred. And yet the story unsettled an entire town, ended a marriage's sense of safety, and remains, more than a decade later, completely unresolved. The house, Westfield, New Jersey, sits about 30 miles outside Manhattan. It's the kind of town real estate listings describe as charming tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, a downtown with coffee shops, and a movie theater that's been there for generations. Residents have compared it, only half-jokingly, to Mayberry. In 2014, it was ranked among the safest towns in the entire country. At the center of this story is a house at 657 Boulevard, a Dutch colonial revival, more than a century old at the time, with 6 bedrooms and a wide, welcoming front porch. It's the kind of house people drive past and imagine raising a family in. In June 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus did exactly that. Derek, a senior vice president at a Manhattan insurance company, and Maria, who had grown up in Westfield herself, bought the home for just under $1.5 million. They had 3 young children, 2 girls and a boy, the oldest around 10, the youngest around 5. The plan was simple: renovate the house a little, move the family in, build a life there. Before the closing was even finalized, something strange happened, though no one knew it yet. On May 26th, about a month before the sale closed, the previous owners, a couple named John and Andrea Woods, received a letter in their mailbox.
It was typed, addressed to them, and signed by someone calling themselves the Watcher. The letter claimed that the house had been under surveillance by the writer's family for generations, that a grandfather had watched it in the 1920s, a father in the 1960s, and that now it was the writer's turn. It asked pointed questions about the house's history and about what might be hidden inside its walls. The Woods family didn't mention this letter to the Broadduses before the sale closed. They would later say they didn't think it was anything more than a prank, something to be brushed off, not passed along. The Broadduses found out about it only after they themselves became targets. The first letter. 3 days after closing on the house, while the Broadduses were beginning renovations and moving furniture in, a letter arrived at 657 Boulevard. It was addressed simply to the new owner. It opened politely, almost warmly, welcoming whoever opened it to the neighborhood. Then it took a turn. The letter asked how the family had ended up there and whether the house itself had somehow called to them. It described the house as having been the subject of the writer's family's attention for decades, and said the writer had now been put in charge of watching it, just as a grandfather and father supposedly had before. It asked whether the family knew the house's history, what might lie within its walls. Then it became more specific. It referenced the family's young children directly, calling them the young blood, and asked whether the house would now be filled with them. It questioned whether bringing children to the house had been an act of greed. Derek and Maria were unsettled, but tried to rationalize it. New homeowners get strange letters sometimes. Maybe it was an eccentric local. Maybe it was a one-time thing. It wasn't. The letters continue. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived. This one was worse. It demonstrated detailed knowledge of the family, their children's birth order, their nicknames, details that weren't public information, It asked which children would sleep in which bedrooms, specifically the rooms facing the street, claiming this information would help the writer plan. It described watching the family through the home's own windows and doors, claiming an intimate, ongoing surveillance of their movements inside the house. And it signed off the same way each letter would going forward, identifying itself only as the Watcher, and insisting it had held dominion over 657 Boulevard for nearly 2 decades. A third letter followed weeks later. By this point, the language had grown more openly threatening. It referenced the family's last name, misspelling it, oddly, as Broaddus, and described their children almost as property already claimed. It told the family that the house was anxious for them to move in, that it had been a long time since young blood filled its hallways the way it apparently once had. The Broadduses had not yet spent a single night inside the house, and the Watcher already seemed to know more about their family than most of their actual neighbors did. They went to the police. Investigation begins. The Westfield Police Department took the case seriously from the start. This wasn't dismissed as a prank complaint. Detectives began looking into the letters as a real threat. The first and most obvious suspects were the people next door, a family named Langford, who had lived beside 657 Boulevard for years and had a famously tense relationship with previous owners of the house. Investigators looked closely at them. But despite the suspicion, no physical evidence ever tied the Langfords to the letters, and they were never charged or definitively linked to the case. Forensic examiners studied the letters themselves. The paper was ordinary, the typeface was common, but one envelope yielded something: trace DNA. When analyzed, it suggested the sender might have been a woman. It was a tantalizing clue, but it never matched any suspect investigators tested, and on its own, it wasn't enough to identify anyone. The postmark on the letters traced back to a USPS distribution facility in Kearney, New Jersey, relatively nearby, but not specific enough to narrow things down to a single sender. Whoever was mailing these letters wasn't doing so directly from a mailbox outside the house. They knew enough, or were careful enough, to avoid that. The Broadduses didn't stop at the police. They hired private investigators. They consulted with former FBI profilers. They tried to build a psychological picture of who could write like this, someone clearly literate, deliberate in their phrasing, who seemed to genuinely believe, or wanted others to believe, in some inherited claim over the house itself. None of it produced a name. Living in fear of an empty house. What makes this case strange, even among unsolved mysteries, is what didn't happen. No one broke in. No physical violence occurred. No one was ever seen lurking outside. The entire threat existed on paper, mailed through an ordinary postal system. And yet the psychological effect on the family was severe. Derek Broaddus installed security cameras throughout the house and had a new alarm system put in. But surveillance against an unknown threat is its own kind of torment. You're not watching for a face you recognize. You're watching for anything. The family made the decision not to move in. Their children stayed in their old home. The new house, the one they'd saved for, planned for, prepared for, sat empty, undergoing renovations no one would ever sleep through the result of. They tried to sell it. Initially, they struggled to find a buyer willing to take on a house with this kind of reputation now attached to it. They also pursued legal action against the previous owners, the Woods family, arguing that failing to disclose the first letter, the one sent before closing, should have voided the deal or entitled them to damages. That lawsuit was ultimately dismissed in 2017. Eventually, the Broadduses rented the house out to a tenant, hoping that putting some distance between themselves and the property might end things. It didn't. The fourth letter. While the house was rented out, a new letter arrived. This one addressed not to the current tenant, but specifically back to Derek and Maria, despite the fact that they no longer lived there. The tone had shifted from ominous curiosity to open hostility. The letter referred to them in openly insulting terms and taunted them directly about the Watcher's identity, suggesting, almost playfully, that the couple might already have spoken to the person responsible. It implied the Watcher could be someone they considered an ordinary neighbor, someone with no apparent reason to be suspected at all. It was, in its way, the most chilling letter of the four, not because of new threats, but because of what it implied, that whoever this was hadn't gone away. They were still paying attention, still aware of where the Broadduses were, even after they'd physically left the house behind. No fifth letter ever arrived. As far as anyone has ever confirmed, the trail simply stopped there, selling at a loss. By 2019, the Broadduses had had enough. They sold 657 Boulevard for just under $960,000, roughly $400,000 less than they had originally paid for it 5 years earlier. It was, in every practical sense, a financial disaster layered on top of an emotional one. They had bought a dream home and walked away having never lived in it, having spent years in legal battles and security consultations, and having lost a significant amount of money in the process. The new owners, a young couple, moved in without incident. According to available reporting, they have never received a letter from the Watcher. Whatever was happening to the Broadduses, whether it was about the house or about them specifically, appears, at least publicly, to have ended once they let go of the property entirely. That detail alone has fueled years of speculation. If the Watcher's obsession was truly with the house itself, as the letters claimed, why would a new family, also raising children, also moving into those same bedrooms, be left alone? It's one of several details in this case that don't fully add up, no matter which theory you favor. Theories and doubt. In the years since, the case has produced no shortage of theories, but no definitive answers. Some point to the neighbors who were initially suspected, despite the lack of evidence connecting them to the letters. Others believe the writer may have had some past connection to the house, perhaps a former resident or someone with personal history tied to the property that's never become public. There's also a theory that's harder for some people to accept, that the Watcher may never have intended real harm at all, and that the letters were an elaborate, sustained act of psychological intimidation by someone who simply enjoyed the power of being feared from a distance. And inevitably, given how strange and well-publicized the case became, a number of skeptics have raised a different question entirely: whether the letters were genuine at all, or whether some element of the story had been embellished. The Broadduses have firmly stood by their account, and the documented police investigation, legal filings, and forensic analysis made clear that something real was happening. Letters were sent, DNA was recovered, law enforcement opened and pursued an active case. But the specific identity and motive behind it all has simply never been confirmed. No charges have ever been filed. According to the Union County Prosecutor's Office, the case is not currently active, but it has never been officially closed either. If new evidence or a credible lead ever surfaces, authorities have said the investigation could resume. Where it stands now. Today, 657 Boulevard looks like any other well-kept house on a quiet street in Westfield. The people living there now go about ordinary lives, apparently undisturbed by the story that once consumed the property's reputation nationwide. The Broadduses eventually sold the rights to their story, which became the basis for a Netflix dramatization in 2022, a fictionalized, heavily embellished version of events that took real liberties with names, location, and plot. But underneath the dramatization is a documented, factual case. Real letters recovered by real investigators, analyzed by real forensic experts, that never led to an arrest. What remains is a simple, uncomfortable truth. Somewhere, possibly still in Westfield, possibly among people the Broadduses once considered neighbors, someone wrote 4 letters detailing intimate knowledge of a family's children, their bedrooms, their routines, and their lives. That person, whoever they were, watched closely enough to know things they shouldn't have known. And then, as far as anyone can tell, they simply stopped. No name, no arrest, no resolution. Just a house that sat empty for years because of words on paper, and a question that has never been answered. Who was watching? And are they watching still?